Never before has a convicted killer defended himself in court on a second murder trial, we understand. But if we thought that Christopher Halliwell, this multiple murderer, would be some kind of criminal mastermind, eloquent and persuasive, we'd be wrong. He was shambolic, dismal, defending himself. He fixated himself on small parts of the case, getting angry and agitated about them, but having no answer about the big point of the case, that being that he confessed that he killed Becky to a detective. And as he was led from the dock here at Bristol Crown Court, smiling, smirking, goading Becky's family, perhaps he cast his mind back to a day in March 2011 when he was arrested, taken into the countryside and quizzed by a detective who threw away the rule book, jeopardised his own career to get this confession. This is about that day, that moment that a detective came face to face with a murderer.
What I can tell you is that a 47-year-old man from Swindon is in custody, having been arrested for kidnap and 2 murders.
Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher on the most dramatic day of his police life, telling reporters he had caught the killer. Sian O'Callaghan had gone missing. They had the CCTV of her being picked up. They knew the cab was Christopher Halliwell's. They had watched him undercover, hoping he would lead them to Sian. He didn't, so they arrested him. Police rules said he should have been cautioned, then taken to a police station. But the detective took a monumental gamble. Instead of taking Chris Halliwell to a police station, getting him a lawyer and reading him his rights, he brought him here to Barbary Castle. It's an Iron Age hill fort south of Swindon. He said later that he believed that Chris Halliwell was keeping Sian O'Callaghan here alive against her wishes. And he said he wanted to plead with Chris Halliwell, man to man, to plead with his conscience, to tell him what had happened to Sian. And it appeared at first that the gamble had worked, because Chris Halliwell turned to the detective and said, "Do you have a car? Let's go." Halliwell led police to a copse of trees here on the Oxfordshire-Wiltshire border. Later that day here, they would find the remains of Sian O'Callaghan, and Chris Halliwell admitted that yes, he was the murderer. In fact, the detective would go on to say that Chris Halliwell just seemed to open up as part of this more informal chat. They were standing here in the shadow of the Uffington White Horse, the 2 men, the detective and the killer, sharing a cigarette. And it was at this point that Christopher Halliwell turned to Steve Fulcher and said, "Would you like another?" Halliwell then led the fleet of police cars through the Cotswold lanes around 20 miles away to this spot in Gloucestershire. He showed them this field and said that he'd murdered a young woman years before. He couldn't remember exactly when. He didn't even know her name, but her body, he said, was in here. Days later, her remains were found and were identified as those of Becky. It seemed so open and shut, but Halliwell's lawyers successfully argued the confession over Becky could not be presented to a jury because the detective broke the rules. The charge over Becky was effectively dropped, although he admitted to Sian's murder and is serving a life sentence. Becky's own family is split over the policeman's actions. Her mother Karen has been campaigning for a change in the law, supporting Mr Fulcher.
Firstly, I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart Steve Fulcher for bringing my little girl home. I will always respect him and will be indebted to him for making that moral decision as a police officer. But he should never have suffered the terrible consequences, loss of reputation and career for doing such a thing.
But Becky's dad disagrees.
Pure anger. It's all through him I've suffered. All through him. He didn't. It's simple. It becomes common practice, doesn't it? When you've been in a job for 30 years, that's the first thing you do. Read and write, get a solicitor. As soon as he said, if you did, you mentioned another, you're reading their rights again. Simple as that. A 30-year experience, a top detective in the UK couldn't even be bothered to do that. Come on. And he's come out with every excuse going, and he's got himself all the publicity going, didn't he? To make it he's this wonderful, caring man.
Mr Fulcher gave evidence at this trial, but not as a serving police officer. He's since been found guilty of gross misconduct and resigned from the force. He can't find a job in Britain, he says. Today has seen the killer's conviction, justice for Becky, and maybe, just maybe, the detective's redemption.
Robert, what's been the reaction from Steve Fulcher today?
Well, I spoke on the phone to Steve Fulcher about an hour ago. He said he is delighted with today's verdict. He also released a statement tonight describing Halliwell as an evil and depraved violator of women. He said, "I did all I could to find an abducted girl. I caught a serial killer, preventing any further girls from being murdered." He goes on to say, "I felt I correctly prioritised the human rights of the victims over the rights of the perpetrator." And he said, "Had I not acted as I did, neither Sean nor Becky would ever have been found, and Halliwell would be free to abduct and kill other girls."
Robert Murphy at Bristol Crown Court, thank you.